We have a real treat for you today. It's Russia's firewall and defending against the future of digital repression with Benjamin Mixon-Baca. Have a great talk.
Yeah, thank you. Hi. Thank you for coming to my talk today. I hope you are excited to learn about Russia's fancy new firewall. So to sort of motivate this discussion, I'm going to start with an example. So imagine you want to surprise your grandmother for her birthday. She absolutely loves cherry peach and eggplant cobbler. And so you, being the good grandson or granddaughter that you are, you go online and you're searching for recipes and you expect to see images like what you see here, right, on your phone. And to your horror, your dismay, your disgust, you see these block pages, right? And then you start to freak out because you know, 5 minutes from now, the autonomous drone swarm is going to arrest you, right? And you're sure about this because your buddy Trevor last week just got arrested for looking up cat pictures. So, you're super nervous. And for anyone who wants to know, I have the prompt that I used to generate this cool image of me getting arrested. So what makes this possible? That's sort of a two-part question. There's going to be a policy component, and then there's going to be sort of a more technical component. In Russia specifically, there's about 7 or 8 laws related to information controls. So here they are right there. The most relevant for this discussion, though, is Federal Law number 90FZ, the Sovereign Internet Law. And it basically sets guidelines for who's supposed to do the regulations, like what body does it, who has to abide by them, so which network operators, and fines and things like that. So Roskomnadzor is the body responsible for enforcing censorship in Russia. Here's a picture of their seal and their headquarters. They go by RKN for short, but basically they coordinate with network operators, ISPs, data centers, and things like that to actually enforce the censorship laws in Russia. So what's blocked? So mostly things that are related to politics are going to be blocked in Russia. So CNN, X is blocked, Google's blocked, Voice of America is blocked. So basically anything that the government deems will be destabilizing to the country is blocked. That pretty much completes the policy portion of this discussion. I think it's good to just have some context around that, but this is primarily going to be a technical discussion of sort of the nuts and bolts of how the TSPU operates. So to start that portion, so here's a picture of a TSPU that's deployed in a cabinet at a data center somewhere. The specific equipment that enforces this censorship policy is called the EcoFilter DPI, and you can see this image there. This is another picture of it, and it's manufactured by a company called RDP.RU. So they were the ones who won out on the bid to provide Roskomnadzor with the censorship equipment, but there was actually a bidding process, and there's some leaked documents where you can read the reviews that all of these companies, this 12 in total, how they performed. The EcoFilter is pretty impressive for a few reasons. If you look at the other equipment, they all basically can process on the order of 10 gigs per second or so of network traffic. The EcoFilter, by contrast, its datasheet says that a single device can process on the order of over 100 gigs per second for one device. So that's very impressive. I've worked on kind of similar DPI applications myself, and it's pretty challenging hitting 1 or 10 gigs per second, much less 100. So yeah, that's just part of the reason why it's impressive in my opinion. Some of the other equipment are all Linux-based. Not all of them, but the ones that I looked into are Linux-based. There's actually ISOs that you can download if you want to poke around. I did that for another one of the devices called Carbon Filter. So there's some goodies in there if anyone's interested in seeing, what else is out there looking for vulnerabilities in this equipment. It might be a fun exercise to do. So just to contextualize censorship, I'm going to start off by discussing a little bit of the Great Firewall of China. For those of you who don't know, it's called the GFW. And it, up until this point, was basically the state-of-the-art for censorship equipment. And it's pretty different from the TSPU. So the GFW is deployed what's known as on path, which means that while it can basically observe and see everything that is traversing the network, it can't, for example, drop packets, right? And it can't, for example, throttle connections. So when you make a request for your recipe for your grandmother, your request is going to traverse a series of nodes. Eventually, and I believe it's somewhere around the 14th hop, so it's kind of deeper into the network, it's going to hit a port mirror, and a copy of your request is going to go to the GFW equipment. And it's going to check, maybe it'll check the SNI, like in a TLS request or something, but it's going to check that. And because it's on path, your actual request will also go to the end server that you're trying to get that recipe from, right? And because it's on path, it has to do something typically called like a reset injection in order to disrupt your request. So when that happens, you'll see a block page or something. And if you're really unlucky, you might have, you might be greeted by one of these autonomous drones to come and arrest you. So that's bad. So by contrast, the TSPU device, they are in path, and this is part of the reason why I was saying it's impressive, because hitting that speed of traffic with an in-path device without sacrificing quality of service, just from a technical standpoint, is pretty incredible. So it's in path, and it's also much closer in the network than the GFW, where the GFW is something like 14 hops away. The TSPU is more like 5. And when we were doing experiments and measuring where the TSPU was, that's what we found. So you make a request, and almost immediately your request is hit by the TSPU, and it will see what you're requesting. It'll see that it's supposed to be blocked, and because it's in path, it can throttle the connection, right? Which is a pretty nasty way of doing censorship, because it's harder to tell if it's legitimate. Legitimate disruption or just like actual censorship. So that's one of the reasons why this is kind of a pain. So just to summarize, basically the sovereign internet law, the RUNet law in Russia, the TSPU is one element of that, but it's actually a fairly broad spectrum approach. They have, in Russia, I believe they have like a national domain name service, the NDSI, so that they can control their domain names. They also have a national root certificate authority. And basically all the apps in Russia that are produced there have to have one of these trusted root certificates. So if you look at, for example, Yandex browser, that certificate is embedded in the app. So you basically have no privacy if you're using Russian apps. They're also locking down their BGP routes, so traffic can't get rerouted. They're using something called RPKI, or Resource Public Key Encryption, or infrastructure. So it's a very broad spectrum approach. So what can we do to kind of get around this? Are we going to have to repurpose our microwaves to fry all of these nasty drones? Maybe. So for some of you hardware hackers out there, maybe you'll get a chance to fry some drones with a microwave. And if you do, you can teach me. That would be cool. But in the interim, there's, I think, some other approaches that I'm going to discuss as far as getting around the censorship. So why is there this divergence in the deployment? Why is the TSPU in path? Why is it closer? There's when compared to the GFW? Well, there's about 3 factors that I think are important to call out here. One is the difference in ISP ecosystem in China compared to Russia. The other is the economics of equipment that can do the censorship, and data, the scale of data. So if you look up the autonomous system numbers in Russia, there's, I think, something like an order of magnitude more ASs in Russia than China. Their ISPs are also more regionally distributed. So to actually deploy this censorship apparatus with this type of network kind of necessitates that it be deployed in path and close to the network. Researchers didn't used to think that it would be possible to have in-path devices about 20 years ago when the GFW was first implemented. But the cost of microprocessors and the density of transistors has made it such that this is feasible again. And I think between that and just how much data we're all spitting out and consuming, having a censorship apparatus which is closer to users makes it, this actually a more ideal approach. I think another interesting thing about this deployment strategy is it also gives Russia finer granularity to perform censorship, so it can be very regionally specific and targeted. So that's kind of an interesting aspect of it. So how do I know that the TSPU is deployed this way? Well, around 2020, 2021, 2022, I was working on something unrelated. I was looking at vulnerabilities in VPN software and specifically in the Linux networking code. And my buddy Dewin, he had just finished doing a censorship study for Russia, and he started talking about a really interesting circumvention strategy. And it turns out that what he said was, if he tried to connect to X or Twitter from a vantage point inside of Russia, and he tried to connect to it, his connection would get throttled. But when if he would spoof a SYN packet to his vantage point in Russia from the outside world, from Twitter, and then connect to the Twitter server, his connection went through. And that sounded really familiar to me because I had been looking at vulnerabilities and stuff and kind of are elbow deep in the Linux kernel stuff. And so what was I looking at? Well, I was looking at the connection tracking frameworks. And connection tracking, it turns out, is common across a lot of different types of devices and intrusion detection systems, right? So here's some connection tracking code for the Zeek IDS. So that's something I want to call out. It's trying to figure out what direction the packet is going in. So is it the client or the server? Here's Surikata's connection tracking code, with just a snippet of it. And kind of doing a similar thing. It's trying to figure out which direction the packet is coming from. This is what I was really looking at the time. This is the net filter code. And there's some special logic to figuring out which direction a packet's going in. And particularly for TCP, this is very challenging. And that's because TCP has something called simultaneous open. So because of simultaneous open, there's not a deterministic way to figure out which side of a connection is the client versus which side is the server. So this becomes really important. So what is simultaneous open? So there is the client on the left-hand side, I think, with the peaches. There's the TSPU censorship device in the middle, and then there's the web server on the right. So the TSPU, it's going to have to track the state of a connection. So it's going to track that in a global table. This is modeled after the way Linux does it, but it's kind of similar for pretty much anything that's tracking connections. So anyways, it's going to have a global table. It's going to track what's called the originator or orig variable. So that's a connection tuple that's internal to external. It's going to also track a connection tuple in the reverse direction, so the reply, so that would be the server, or external to internal. And in the case of TCP, it has to also track its view of the TCP state. So with simultaneous open, let's just pretend that the web server initiates a connection, so it's going to send a SYN packet. From the TSPU's perspective, it's going to be in a SYN sent state. And then, because we're doing simultaneous open, the client is going to send a connection request to SYN packet. And from the TSPU's perspective, it's going to be SYN sent to. So that's just another way of saying simultaneous open. Then the web server is going to send a SYN ACK. So we're in SYN received state. And then, of course, the client sends its SYN ACK, so still SYN received. And then the web server is going to complete its side of the three-way handshake, and now TSPU thinks it's in an established state. And the client finishes its side of the three-way handshake, and now it's also in. Now we're established. So that pretty much summarizes how simultaneous open works. And it turns out that because of this weird ambiguity in the directions of connections, especially with TCP, that it allows us to use what's called a server-side bypass. So when you're talking about censorship circumvention, there's kind of two flavors of strategies. There's the server-side strategies, which just means that the server initiates or modifies or sends packets in some way to bypass the firewall. And so I'm just going to call this the simultaneous open bypass. Oops. Okay. All right. So for this censorship circumvention strategy to work, your internal client has to coordinate with an external server. So this external client is somebody outside of Russia, for example. And so the way the strategy works is you'll have to send a SYN packet towards your internal vantage point, and the TSPU thinks it's in SYN sent state. If you'll notice, that packet doesn't actually reach the client, so it is TTL limited. And that's significant because if it were to reach the client, then that client would send probably a reset ACK, and it would reset the state of the connection from the TSPU's perspective, and it would basically corrupt the state that we need to be in. And so the internal client then sends a SYN packet. And so this is, from the TSPU's perspective, it's in SYN sent, but in reality, it's going to be, the states are going to be inconsistent between the TSPU and the actual connection endpoints. So then the web server is going to send a SYN ACK. The TSPU thinks it's in SYN received. And then the client's going to send its last ACK, and then it's going to actually make a request to your web server or to the recipe website or whatever. So I'm going to kind of skip over that for now. I'll get back to that in a second. But basically what that allows you to do is bypass the throttling that would normally happen. So there's some other security implications for some of this connection tracking stuff that I was telling you about. It turns out that you can use that to mess with VPNs as well. So we just presented a paper on some attacks that we had developed against VPNs. We developed an exploit primitive that we call the port shadow, and it basically allows you to port scan somebody behind a VPN. It allows you to de-anonymize or remove the encryption from the VPN. And it also allows you to basically reroute packets in really interesting ways. And in particular, it allows you to basically escalate from an adjacent position to in path. So this connection tracking stuff is actually it's super important, and it has broad security implications, and I think that's an important thing to understand. So here, if you want to read more about the technical details of some of that stuff, just download the slides. There's the links to it. So I just kind of went over the server-side bypass strategies. And while we were doing all of this analysis, we were sending TCP packets with different flags and in different sequences, and we kind of stumbled upon a client-side bypass strategy. So with a client-side bypass strategy, that means the client sends packets in some weird way to be able to bypass the firewall. And it turns out that if you send 5 ACKs in a particular order, you can also bypass the censorship. So to understand how we have a hypothesis as to why it is 5 ACKs that allows for this type of behavior, and it has to do with the TLS 4-way handshake. So let's just assume that you already do your TCP 3-way handshake. The last ACK that the client sends, let's just count that as the first ACK, right? So that's ACK number 1 from the client to the server. And then when you initiate a TLS 4-way handshake, you're going to have to send what's called a client hello. And it's typically broken across at least 2 packets with ACKs. So that's going to be ACK number 2 and ACK number 3. And then at that point, the TSPU, when there's a TLS connection, it has to figure out how to block specific content, and typically it uses what's called SNI-based filtering to do that. So the server name indication is plain text, and that's what the TSPU devices will use to basically fingerprint a connection and perform censorship. So then the web server, after it gets a client hello, it's going to send its own server hello. And that's basically just negotiating cryptographic parameters. And then the client is going to acknowledge that. So that's ACK number 4. And then the web server's probably going to push data at that point, and then the client, of course, is going to ACK those packets. And that's typically when censorship happens. So what we found, and again, this was pretty much just like serendipitous, it was completely accidental. What we found was that, let's just say you go through the regular TCP 3-way handshake. So we found that if you send 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ACKs, and then you actually start your client hello. So client hello with the SNI, that would normally be blocked. What we think is happening is that there's a buffer inside the TSPU devices, and because of that, they need to buffer some amount of TCP packets with data in it, and because of that, there is, it uses the fact that these are ACK packets with data to basically do the reassembly and check for an SNI to see whether or not it's blocked. And we think that this somehow disrupts the internal state, and that's why this client-side bypass strategy works. That's our working theory, but yeah, it was just kind of interesting to see. So then, yeah, the client the web server will send a server hello. Client's going to ACK that, and the server is going to send some data, right? Your recipe that you wanted, and then there's no throttling. So we thought that was really interesting, right? And like I said, our theory is that it's because there's a buffer, and it needs to keep track of and do reassembly with those packets. So there's some emerging threats and challenges in this space. What I didn't talk about too much was the fact that a lot of people in Russia use VPNs, specifically shadow socks or similar fully encrypted protocols to bypass censorship. And in fact, if you try to download a VPN in Russia, the Russian government has asked Google Play, Apple, App Store, and other App Store providers to remove VPNs from their offering for Russian citizens. So it's illegal, and it's also illegal to provide information about how to get around censorship. So this is a website called applecensorship.com. It's deployed by or maintained by the Great Fire Project. So it's a nifty website for seeing what's blocked in various countries. They also have one for Google censorship. So you can see here there's VPNs that are are not accessible in Russia or China. So this has created kind of an interesting, this has kind of created a market force where, because there's VPNs are no longer, legal to have in those countries, we're starting to see an increase in backdoored and malware, like VPNs with basically malware in them. There's a project called the Domain Name Tools Investigations, and they actually have seen a surge in malware URLs for VPNs, and that's pretty consistent with. So this is in this case it's Chinese VPNs, but my preliminary analysis of Russian-based VPNs is kind of showing agreement with this. So if anyone is interested in kind of checking that work out by them, that here's the URL for it. So what does that? What do backdoor VPNs look like? Well, here's an example that I worked on a little while ago. This VPN, it's called an accelerator. It's called Quaifon. So here's the legitimate website for this app. That's its domain, and then here is the basically the malicious website. So obviously they're different. If you look at their whois information, it's going to be different. You'll know. And it turns out that when you start reverse engineering the APK for the malicious VPN, it's, for those of you who don't know, this is obfuscation. There's some reflection going on. There's also the names of various strings and class names and method names are encrypted. So you can see that here. So those get decrypted, and then it tries to load a shared library. This is actually a packer called Jigua. It's by Chiho 360. They're a big Chinese cybersecurity firm, and this is the packer that they use for obfuscating their apps. So in addition to the malicious VPNs. There's also a threat that some providers who you might think are legitimate are not fully transparent in terms of like who they're, like you might like look up, like do some research on who they are. And on their website, you will think that it's one company, and then it turns out that it's another company. So actually, an organization by the name of the Tech Transparency Project, they uncovered recently connections between several Chinese VPNs and the People's Liberation Army. And I was kind of working on some similar work at the time. Specifically, there's VPNs that are pretty popular. One of them is called Turbo VPN, but there's like 3 other VPNs from that report. But if you look, so if you dig into their business records, if you go to opencorporates.com and look up Innovative Connecting, you'll see that their copyright information shows that they're based out of Beijing. But if you were to look on their website or their Google Play profile, it says Singapore. So, and that information is not immediately obvious when you actually look up this organization. But it's actually worse than that. So it turns out, so I was reverse engineering these apps because we were really concerned about the transparency of these providers. And they use a tunneling protocol called ShadowSocks. ShadowSocks uses symmetric cryptography. And what's even worse is that in the case of these apps, they actually hard code the password into the APK. So that's really bad. Right, like that basically means that anyone on the network who can enumerate the IPs of the VPN servers can decrypt the traffic for these particular VPNs, and that's exactly what I did. So that's some obfuscated traffic, and then that's the decrypted version of the same traffic. And there's actually, in addition to the 3 VPNs from the Tech Transparency Project's reporting, I also uncovered 5 other VPN providers that they all appear to be linked to Chiho 360. I'm still working on confirming that. They're for sure controlled by a Chinese national, but that information is not disclosed. So there's a kind of a transparency issue with that, and the fact that they also use symmetric cryptography with hard-coded passwords is, a pretty big security issue. So I just presented some of that work at a workshop called Foci. If you want to read about the technical details of that, that's the link to the report there. And then one of the last threats that is sort of an emerging thing is it seems like the Russian government is going towards whitelisting, and that's going to be a real challenge to get around. But in the interim, I was saying we discovered client-side bypass strategies, right? Those are preferred to the server-side bypass strategies because in the server-side case, right, you need an external machine to sort of coordinate with. And that doesn't really work for big companies like Google, Twitter. And so really what you want are client-side bypass strategies. But it doesn't really work for us to test one vantage point and then just randomly discover, accidentally techniques, because it's really hard for us to be able to deploy those at scale. So it's kind of like a whack-a-mole scenario, right? We find one thing and then we might be able to tell one or two people and that's it. Like, how do we scale this up? Well, there's fundamental design issues in network protocols, and specifically in things like stateful firewalls trying to track them. So you can think of those like cracks or chinks in the armor for the firewall. And what we're basically trying to do now, what we're in the process of developing, is essentially something like an embedded state machine that can basically automatically discover new client-side bypass strategies. I know there's some other work in this space. This is an example of TLA+. It's a temporal logic. It's a logic programming language. But the idea is to use something like this to basically provide developers with some means of automatically bypassing censorship without having to depend on end users having rooted devices or be super technical. We want this to be something that anyone can use, that developers can benefit from, and so that's kind of the direction things are going in now. So let's see. Kind of flew through the talk a little bit. So I have a demo now. This demo is not, it's basically just going over how connection tracking works, and showing how, even in the face of SNI based filtering, how people are typically getting around that, and just explaining some of the connection tracking stuff. So to do this, I installed this, it's basically a network filter module for doing SNI-based filtering. So shout out to Lochner for writing this cool module. So if anyone wants to check that out.
Today I'm going to run just an example of how a stateful firewall that does SNI-based filtering could work, just based on my observations. This is basically the topology I've got going on in my test environment. So the TSPU device is effectively this device here, this NAT gateway. The target behind the TSPU, which would be like a Russian citizen, for example, is some web client, whatever. And to get to the internet, their traffic has to get routed through the NAT gateway or TSPU. So I'm just going to show with and without SNI-based filtering using NetFilter. And then I'm going to show how things kind of currently work. I'm going to use OpenVPN in this example, but in reality, the TSPU actually does block OpenVPN at least the vanilla version of that protocol. But this is just for illustrative purposes. So to get started, I have several terminals open. The left-hand side is the firewall or TSPU device. So that's both of these terminals here. The upper right is going to be the VPN server. And then these two devices in the lower right are going to be the targets behind the TSPU device. So I just got to make sure my routes are correct real quick. So I want to do, I'm just going to I just want to make sure I don't get all my SSH traffic. So I'm just going to download facebook.com real quick. Right, and so obviously that's getting routed through the TSPU device. And if I look at the connection tracking table, we should see, yep, there's Facebook's IP address. And you'll see in the originator direction, this is the target's IP address, and that would be their public IP address in real life, whatever their ISP assigned to them. This is Facebook's destination IP address, and you can see this is in the originator direction, the source port. The destination port is going to be obviously 443, and then we have the contract information in the reply direction. So the connection tuples, sources and destination ports and IPs are flipped. In this case, the connection is in the assured state because packets have been sent in both directions. And so now that that's taken care of, what I'm going to do is add a SNI-based firewall rule. In this case, I'm just using a net filter just for ease of demonstration. This is a custom module that someone wrote, and I'll post a link just to give credit where credit's due because I thought this was really cool implementation. So now that the SNI-based net filtering is in place, we'll try to go ahead and get Facebook again, and I'm gonna again dump the network interface. So obviously now, because the firewall is in path, it can drop any packets it wants, right? It doesn't have to do reset injection. It can just drop arbitrary packets and interfere pretty invasively that way. Okay. Oops. Right, so now that I've done that, what I want to do is run a VPN client. So in this case, I'm going to do the client 2 config. There's no reason in particular why I'm doing it that way, actually. There we go. All right, so the connection's initiated. I do have to delete the current default route, which is through the TSPU interface. And then I'm going to add a default route for the ton 0 interface, which is IP route add default dev. There we go. Okay. So now any not port 22 because I don't want my SSH traffic. So now when I do wget facebook.com, I should, yep, so I got that. Okay, that looks right. Now I'm going to dump the connection tracking table again. This time we can see that old connection. These are old connection tuples from when the SNI firewall rule was in place originally and couldn't get through. but you'll notice that for this particular connection tuple, where is it? There is there's no entry for the current connection to Facebook. But there is a connection in the connection tracking table for the VPN connection. So anytime a connection traverses an in-path device in this way, the contract table is going to be populated with these connection tracking entries. So that is how one would do SNI-based filtering with NetFilter. You might implement some additional optimizations like using XDataPath or eBPF or some other data plane toolkit. There's like DPDK, for example, or PFRing, or you might do it in hardware or something. But hopefully this kind of gives you a sense for how this would work for at least in this case. So, yep, thank you.
Yeah, so that's pretty much what I got. That's my contact info, yeah. So thank you.